I think we're live. Hello, everyone. Hello to the Hachette Social Club. We're so excited that you're here. We're so excited to talk with Jen Wright, who is the brilliant author of this book, Madame Restel. If you haven't read it, you should definitely pick up a copy. It is funny and smart and incredibly relevant. I should probably introduce myself at some point. My name is Carrie Napolitano. I'm Jen's editor and number one cheerleader of this book from like day one. I'm just so excited to talk about this. So hello, Jen.
Hello, it is so great to be here. And thank you so much for being such a massive cheerleader for Madame Restel through this whole process.
Oh, hell yeah. I just think she's such an interesting figure. And I think, the way that we think of women in the 19th century as being, kind of like buttoned up and prim and proper, she just kind of smashes all of those stereotypes. So before we get started, for anyone that hasn't yet read the book or doesn't know anything about Madame Marcel, I would love for you to talk a little bit about who she was and how you learned about her.
Well, Madame Estelle was born Anne Trout. She was a British immigrant from Painswick who came over to America, like so many immigrants, hoping to make a fortune in America. And pretty much as soon as she got there, her husband died, and she was left with a toddler to take care of by herself on New York's Lower East Side. And this was a time when a huge surge of women were not only moving from rural America into urban centers like New York, but also entering the workforce. And they were working for very, very little money, and they were working very long days, which made it very difficult to care for a young child and also work 16-hour days in a factory. So Madame Ristel pretty quickly realized that there was a need for birth control in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that having children you did not plan could be truly disastrous for women's lives. And she lived down the street from a pill compounder at a time when you could pretty much take any herbs you want, smash them into some pills, and say, okay, these are going to cure your headaches, or this will cure insomnia. And maybe they worked and maybe they didn't. But Madame Restel started compounding birth control pills using ingredients like tansy oil and turpentine, which are used into modern history but should not be used. They are incredibly dangerous. And one of the most remarkable things to me about Madame Restel is that she was able to combine these ingredients, and we don't have any record of her having killed her patients. And she also started learning how to do surgical abortions. And she operated on a sliding scale. So she would charge wealthy women $100, but she would get very, very low in price if you were a servant who came in and really didn't have any money but desperately needed an abortion. And she did go on to become one of the wealthiest women in New York and built a spectacular mansion where she continued to perform abortions, rode through the streets in a magnificent carriage, was draped in diamonds and fabulous clothing, and really just enjoyed the fruits of her success in a way that probably antagonized people as much as the fact that she was performing abortions.
Yeah, she's the best thing I think about Madame Restel is that at any chance she gets to just like flip a bird to her haters, she is gonna flip that bird on both fingers.
Yes.
And I just love the different ways that she does it, and she really subverts a lot of like the societal customs and like what a lady should do at the time. You mentioned in the book that she buys this extravagant carriage and is rolling through like Fifth Avenue in this extravagant carriage, like decked out in jewels and just like basically showing off her wealth. For a little context, like what were other women doing that? Like what?
I mean, okay, so I got very fascinated by carriages and
As you should.
the politics surrounding carriages during this period. And there are so many newspaper articles that begin and dedicate paragraphs to the fact that Madame Ricastel has these gorgeous horses and this gorgeous carriage, and it's so fabulous and it's so beautiful, and everybody wishes they had it. And I think I have this flawed BBC notion of the world in the 19th century where, like, didn't a lot of people have carriages? No, they did not. Most people either walked because you lived in a city, or they went around on streetcars, which were very, very popular during this period. And to have a horse and carriage wasn't just like having a beautiful car today. You could buy a Jaguar tomorrow, and most of your expenditure would just go towards buying the Jaguar, other than the fact that you have to get gas for it and maybe get it repaired a few times. But if you have a horse and carriage, that is a constant flow of expense. You need to pay for the coachman. You need to make sure you have a residence for the coachman. You need to make sure you have an additional building to house the carriage in New York, where space is very limited. You need to be paying to feed the horses. You need to be paying for all of the horses' healthcare needs. So if you had a carriage, that spoke to the fact that you not only had money, but you had so much money coming in that you were not really thinking about it going out anymore. And it's why carriages were this massive status symbol during this period in a way that even having a car like a Porsche or a Jaguar would not be today. George Washington had a carriage that was all white and gilded. And it required constant cleaning anytime you went out because mud got on it all the time. And it was considered the thing that put him on par with royals in Europe when he had it. It's also one of the reasons that the carriage tax was one of the first American taxes proposed, that you could tax people who had carriages on their carriages. And people hated it because, in true American fashion, everybody wanted to think that they might not have a carriage right now, but they were gonna have a carriage.
It's a millionaire tax.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're all gonna be millionaires. So
Yeah.
why do you want that?
We're all gonna be able to afford carriages.
Yeah.
So it's good to like put ourselves in a position where when we do have the carriages
Yeah.
and horses and all that, we don't have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
I just love this idea. And something else I really love that RESTELL, obviously at this time, there is, abortion and women's health care in general is a really, really hot topic. And so going up to that, I want to give our social club members a little bit of an idea of like what the history of abortion in the world up to the 1800s abridged.
Well, abortion has been practiced in almost every society from the beginning of the written word. And it was very common in places like ancient Greece and Rome, where it was kind of frowned upon as something that was depriving your husband of his property if you were a woman. But it was also fairly accepted. One of the few societies that did fully ban abortion was ancient Persia. And ancient Persians said that if you had an abortion, the midwife would be killed, you would be killed, and your lover would be killed. But yes, no, ancient Persia's punishments are horrible. Judges, famously, one judge sat on a chair made out of the flayed skin of former corrupt judges. So there were a lot of ancient Persian punishments that go really hard. But
yeah,
ancient Persia also had a system set up where if you had a child that did not have a father, then another man had to raise it to adulthood. Women were fully paid for if you had a child. Like there was a social safety net in ancient Persia that does not exist today, which does not mean that anybody in ancient Persia deserved to have everybody around them executed for having an abortion. But yeah, there is no society where abortion has not been a common fact of life. And I think we see that in a lot of writings from various periods. One of the ones that's interesting and sometimes evoked by anti-abortion rights activists today is that the Hippocratic Oath says that you will not induce an abortion. That's actually a flawed translation. What it says is that you will not use an abortive pessary, which would be something like ground up beetles that a woman could then shove into her vagina to induce infection, which would cause her to miscarry. But unfortunately, it would probably also cause her to go septic and maybe die in the process. So the Hippocratic Oath actually suggests alternative methods for inducing a miscarriage, like jumping up and down really forcefully with your arms above your head. So, as long as there has been society, there have been people worried about having too many children, people worried about having children out of wedlock, and therefore there has been a need for need for abortionists and abortions.
Yeah, I love the idea of, the Hippocratic Oath basically funding big trampoline, because essentially that's what they're doing. Something I found really interesting while editing this book was, and you touched on it a little bit, this idea of whether the church allows abortion or not, and the church is changing positions on abortion and when abortion became considered a sin, because it's changed. And I feel like the rhetoric that we get today a lot is that it's always been this way and that it's been passed down from like millennia. But the reality of it is a lot of it is about it being retranslated over and over in different contexts to suit the time. And granted, like, neither of us are theologians, or Catholics or anything like that. But I found this argument really interesting given a lot of the anti-abortion rhetoric we're given. So
I mean,
I'd love for you to talk about that a little.
I think it's certainly fair to say that the church has always considered abortion immoral. But I think there have been questions of personhood that have changed over time. Up until 1869, abortion wasn't considered a sin worthy of excommunication, because if it was performed before the fetus had quickened or before a woman could feel the fetus moving inside her. And in the 16th century, the Catholic Church, I think it was 1521, don't quote me on it, but the Catholic Church determined that that happened somewhere around 24 weeks. And that's indeed the cutoff for abortion in many places in the US today. So 24 weeks gets you 6 months into pregnancy. So there was, a lot of time prior to that where the fetus might be considered a potential person, but not yet a full individual. And I think there are still many theological questions about that every individual person has to determine for themselves.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think it's just interesting because I think, as scientific advancement has allowed us different views into the reproductive cycle and what, like the infancy looks like, so has our opinion of what life and looks like. And I think that's really important to consider here. Something else that's happening at the same time that's really interesting is that, and you touch on it a lot in your book, is that simultaneously with these changing attitudes around, personhood for a fetus and abortion and different medical techniques, you also have this switch from healthcare and medicine being something that's predominantly carried out by women in different societies to being handed over kind of to men, like taken over by men in a way.
Well, I think something that's really important that happens during this period. I should begin by saying that I'd always heard that eventually doctors wanted to kind of elbow in on midwives and take over their profession for the money. But I never really know why it happens during this period. And one of the reasons for that is through the 18th century, doctors were usually just apprenticed to another doctor. So if your father was the town doctor, you would study under him, you'd learn how to set a broken bone. Then one day your dad would die and you'd become the town doctor. And maybe you'd be a little bit better than him, maybe you'd be a little bit worse than him, but you'd basically be doing what he taught you to do. And hopefully he would have been teaching you for many, many years, and you'd have a fairly good basic training. And that changed as wealthy people were suddenly able to go abroad and they could study in places like Paris, where you would walk the hospitals and you talk to Parisian people who were on the forefront of medical technology, and you'd hear them lecture and you'd see people suffering from different ailments and see how they were being treated. And that was made possible because ships got so much better during this period. And you could suddenly make these big trips and then return to America. And in the 1840s, Americans started thinking, well, we can just do that here. You don't need to go abroad. And people started renting out lecture halls and offering 6 months courses where you could train to be a doctor. And you might never see a patient during this. Often the only thing that was really used was a bag of bones. And many of the men who signed up for these courses didn't attend most of the lectures. They were asked a few questions at the end, and then if they had paid their money for this, they were presented with a diploma. And what that resulted in was 4 times as many doctors as many towns needed. So there was suddenly a huge surplus of doctors and not enough patients. And one area of medicine that had been largely left to women was midwifery, because, among other things, doctors during this period were discouraged from looking at a nude female patient because it would upset her modesty so terribly. So wonderful for not upsetting a woman's modesty if you're not looking at her naked body, very bad for diagnosing any problems that might be going on there.
Yeah.
Doctors also, understandably, were not looking at any pregnant women during their training sessions, again, because of women's modesty. So doctors really knew very little about how to deliver babies safely and effectively. But they needed more patients. And because of that, they started trying to paint midwives as barbarian relics that could not perform the job as well or as morally as they would. And one way to make it clear that they were more moral was to say that midwives frequently performed abortions. So that was part of how the male medical establishment was able to take over as OBGYNs.
It's wild that all of this is happening at the same time, and it just, it just goes to show, if we look at the majority of human history, like, women have been caring for women in terms of bringing new life into the world, and then all of a sudden, because of capitalism, it's like, oh, I guess men are going to do it for a little bit, and we're like clawing our way back essentially.
Yeah. And we know that there were some real practical problems that went along with that. Ignaz Semmelweis, who suggested, because women were dying at such a horrible rate when they were treated by doctors in his clinic, as opposed to midwives at the other clinic, that maybe doctors should start washing their hands, that they shouldn't go directly from having their hands in a cadaver to putting them in women's birth canal. And he was rejected. And one of the reasons he was rejected was because doctors are gentlemen, and gentlemen have clean hands.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I always read that quote and think, well, they could have looked at their hands and seen that their hands were covered with corpse blood, and that
Why
should have been.
wouldn't you want to wash your hands?
Maybe it would be great to wash your hands before you go and deliver a baby. But yeah, when Ignaz Semmelweis tested his theory and got doctors to wash their hands, the death rate dropped to be approximately on par with the midwives. It was great. And then he was fired, and he ended his life in a mental institution where he was beaten to death by the guards.
Oh.
Yeah, probably because he had syphilis, not because he was like so sad about his theory being rejected that he went crazy, but probably because
I was just thinking, like, those guards really don't want to wash their hands. Like, really bad. Something you were talking about, how the idea that these skills are passed on, kind of, like, from father to son, or from a midwife to her daughter, in other kinds of societies. One of the most interesting things about Madame Restel is that she, as far as we know, like, she didn't come from a long line of female health practitioners that we know of. Like, she in many ways seemed kind of not self-taught, but like she found her own education in a lot of ways.
Wasn't entirely self-taught, and I kind of think something that happens a great deal with Madame Estelle is a man teaches her how to do something and she immediately does it much better than they can.
And I love that for her.
Yeah, her first husband was a tailor, and people talk about how he was a tailor, but he was also an alcoholic. So Madame Estelle took over the tailoring business and just did an incredible job. And then when she moved to the Lower East Side, I think it's very likely that the pill compounder, Dr. Evans, who she learned how to compound pills from, also sold some kind of birth control pill that may or may not have been effective. We just know that Madame Restell's were really effective. She had patients who said that they successfully miscarried 5 times using these pills. So for whatever reason, Madame Restell just got a huge amount of business that maybe this man who taught her how to theoretically do this was not getting. And I think it's likely that that man also knew how to do surgical abortions and probably showed her how to do it. It was pretty common for pill compounders to also offer surgical abortions because often the birth control pills that they were selling did not work.
I feel like there's probably a reason we're not using tansy oil a lot of the time today.
Yeah, because it can kill you. One of the reasons that we don't use a lot of the things that they use in is because it can kill you, which doesn't mean that people have stopped using them. Doctors during the 1970s said that turpentine was a kind of harrowing motif when it came to do-it-yourself abortions. And I always think it's important to remember that as recently as 2016, a woman in Tennessee tried to induce an abortion using a coat hanger. So I think people in this chat, as very well-read people, might think that, we're at least in a better place in regards of medicines we can use to induce abortions. But I think with more laws cracking down, we may not be in a better place for long.
Yeah, a theme that comes up a lot is that, the need for abortions is not going to change regardless of whether or not people have access to them. And I think, in a lot of ways, the unfortunate repercussions that we're seeing is that, people that really want to have abortions and don't have access to travel to other states, or, who are suffering at different socioeconomic levels, or, it really affects people that need our help the most because they're not able to get it.
Yeah, and those people are going to do incredibly dangerous things to induce abortions, and
it's horrifying.
And we're going to be seeing more of those in the news in the next few years.
I just can't believe that we're back here. History in so many ways, and I know, as someone who has studied history as much as you have, like, I've read a lot of history, like, it seems like we go in these cycles over and over again. And if we don't read about history, we are really doomed to repeat it.
Yes, and if we do read about it, then we're doomed to sit around and watch everyone else repeat it.
And pull out our hair.
I don't think Madame Restell ever thought that things would go backwards in her own lifetime either. When Madame Restell, the first law against abortion in America, I think, was passed in 1821. And when Madame Restell was performing abortions, it was still considered a misdemeanor if you did it before the quickening. It was usually punished by a fine, and it certainly could never be punished with more than a year in jail. And then by the end of Madame Restell's life in the 1870s, even sharing information about abortions or writing about abortions was extremely illegal and forbidden. So things do go backwards, and they go backwards very, very quickly over a matter of decades. And then it took about 100 years from the 1870s onward to get back to a place where people were again receiving safe abortions from trained professionals. And there are now pushes to reinstitute the Comstock laws that made sharing information about abortion illegal. So yeah, I think we are going very far back very, very quickly.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about, that performing an abortion was considered a misdemeanor at the time. And even though Madame Restell never lost a patient that we know of, she did go to prison. And one of my favorite parts of this book is that she goes to prison and she basically like girl bosses the hell out of that prison.
Immediately.
I have never heard of someone just like totally taking over a prison like this, but
it was an option. I don't think the warden knew that was an option either.
Yeah.
Madame Restell did perform a post-quickening abortion. So she was sent off to Blackwell's Island, which was a terrifying prison. There were people who committed suicide rather than being sent to this very, very scary prison. If you've read Nellie Bly, she was in the madhouse. It was also on Blackwell's Island, and conditions in the prison were pretty similar. So Madame Restell got there and seemingly without actually bribing anyone, just took over the warden's office to use for her correspondence. She had the warden's wife make all of her meals, which were lovely. She did bribe the ferryman to smuggle in peaches because she liked fresh peaches for breakfast. And she also made the other prisoners into her servants, and they were pretty psyched about it seemed like. They talked about how like this was an eminent lady, and they would bring her papers for her, and they would bring in a feather bed for her to sleep on every night, and her cell was filled with like books and lamps so she could keep up with her reading. And she also did not wear the typical prison uniform. And the work that a lot of the female prisoners were made to do was seamstress work. And one of my favorite little Madame Restell moments when she's in prison is she holds up like a bad apron and says, "Oh, I just can't make a garment the way some of the others can. Can't do it, I guess." She took over her husband's entire tailoring business. She was an incredibly successful seamstress. It was her first incredible skill. I love that Madame Restell just fully enters the prison like she is visiting it as the Queen of England. And this is like a hotel that she's going to need to stay in for a year. And the warden was apparently always like coming over and having conversations with her and checking to see if she was comfortable. So I'm sure it was still very unpleasant for her to be in prison. Like I'm sure it was cold and drafty, but otherwise I don't think Madame Restell had the experience in prison that almost anyone else has in prison. Unless again you are very rich, because you do hear later about like mobsters and prohibition bosses during the 1920s who do get to have a similar experience in prison that Madame Restell had in prison.
Yeah, this is one of those scenes, and we've talked about this a lot, where from the second I started reading this proposal and about her life, I'm like, I can envision this as a movie or a TV show. And it's really just like, she's so funny, and some of her quips are just so modern, even though she said them like over 100 years ago. And this scene in particular with her just like running the entire prison would be like an excellent season of TV, I think.
It's one of my favorite parts of Goodfellas, which is the only thing I can compare this to.
Yeah. It's so, you know, we talked about this a little bit, but if you have like a dream cast for who you would want to be Madame Restell, you know, obviously we don't have a lot of pictures of what she looked like, and so this could really come from anywhere. But when readers are reading this book, and kind of imagining this in their head, like, who are you thinking of as Madame Restell?
You know, I think Emily Blunt would be fabulous. I think she'd be really good. She'd be one of my top choices. I also really love Ava Green.
Yeah.
And I think she does historical dramas and wears costumes very, very well. So I think she'd be fun. And Claire Foy would be another one.
Yeah.
Who was wonderful and was great on The Crown. So I think there are a lot of women who and that's if you wanted to do young Madame Restell. If you wanted to do Madame Restell, Leslie Manville would be incredible. I love seeing her in anything. Glenn Close would be amazing. That would be so cool. So yeah, I can see so many people potentially being Madame Restell. And I'd love to see that because all of the newspaper articles talk about how incredibly beautiful she is and what a charming woman she is and how delightful she is to talk to. And all of the pictures we have her like with full-on demon wings, like trying to eat a baby. Um, so I would love to see her portrayed not in that incredibly depressing light.
Yeah, I think, it's so funny that uh she's so modern in so many ways. And I think another thing that we're talking a lot about with, prominent female characters is they don't necessarily have to be likable. And you and I talked about this a lot while we were editing the book, that there are a lot of things that Restell does where you're like, yes, girl, do it. And then there are things where you're like, no, please
No,
stop.
don't do that. No.
That's so bad. Yeah.
So maybe it's very objectively bad. And
Yeah.
I do always get a little bit worried. Like, I don't want to see Madame Restell on one of those RBG candles. I think she's a much more
A prayer
complicated
candle.
yeah, I think she is a fascinating figure, but she's also a very complicated figure, and
Yeah.
yeah, and a very human figure, and somebody who was working in the constraints of the time, where in the case where she kidnapped a baby, she was being paid by this woman's father who did not want his daughter to be an unwed mother with a child, and asked Madame Restell to take this baby and put it up for adoption. So she helped the woman deliver the baby, and then she put the baby up for adoption. The woman did not consent to that. The woman wanted to keep her child and spent the rest of her life searching for her child. It's a really tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you asked Madame Restell, she said, "Well, I was doing my job. That's what I was asked to do." And I think it's important to remember that even when it came to Madame Restell, the men were the people with the power.
Yeah, like even if you are extraordinarily wealthy,
You're extraordinarily
wealth can
wealthy.
only do so much. Like you're still constrained by your sex.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason that Madame Restell was so surprised when the laws changed so quickly towards the end of her life, because she was casually bribing politicians. She never got into the suffragette movement because she just thought, like, she just had enough money. She'd just bribe whoever she needed to bribe. And then when that shifted, I think she was very surprised to find that her wealth had its limits.
It is really interesting to see her in the context of how she interacted with other women, particularly. Like she was obviously very aware of the fact that it was really hard for a woman, let alone an immigrant woman, let alone a single mom, essentially, to get a leg up in the world. And yet she wasn't super interested in like helping other women or like getting women to vote. Like she
I
seemed like it didn't really apply to her sometimes.
there's this I was reading a lot about the suffragettes when I was writing this, and
Yeah.
they're wonderful human beings. They are mostly Quakers who believe in a life of simplicity and modesty, of which I think goes very counter to Restell's character. And
Yeah.
I also read this one letter from one of the suffragettes, I can't remember who, that talks about how they're all so afraid of public speaking that after they do public speaking, they just all have to hold each other in like a big embrace, and they all cry because it was just so hard being out in public and having people look at you. And I get it. I understand that public speaking is anxiety producing, but I also think that Madame Restell, a woman who just walked into a jail and was like, I guess this is my house now. Who's gonna be my maid?
Yeah.
Would fundamentally not understand joining a group hug with a bunch of women who were brought to tears by the experience of speaking on stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, she does not have female friends. All her friends are men. She is absolutely one of those girls.
Hashtag toxic.
Yeah, hashtag very toxic.
Well, and it's interesting too to look at a lot of what we have of her own words and her own writing is through op-eds that she places in the newspaper. And that's really, what we can form an idea of what her personality was like and how rebellious she was, and, not willing to just sit down and take whatever they were throwing at her. And I love how her voice comes through in these op-eds.
One of the other things that I love, and I just want to talk about this in case we run out of time, is
Yeah.
that think her two really close female relationships were her daughter and her granddaughter. And I
Yeah.
think her daughter, she works so hard to make this woman perfectly respectable. That the mayor officiated her daughter's wedding. She sent her daughter abroad to be educated in Europe. She and her second husband go to visit her daughter all the time. And, there are records from the time that talk about how her daughter is incredibly beautiful. She's a really well brought up, lovely, soft spoken lady. And then her daughter had two children die, and her husband died in the Civil War, and her daughter became an alcoholic and remarried a policeman, and their lives fell totally apart. And they fell so apart that Madame Restell's remaining grandchildren, her grandson and her granddaughter, went to live with her. And the treatment of her granddaughter seems to be so different to me. That Madame Restell wanted her daughter to publish a book of poems. She thought that maybe her daughter would be a poet. And Madame Restell, I think, raised her daughter to be what she thought a well-bred woman in America would be. And she raised her granddaughter to be herself. Her granddaughter is covered in diamonds. Her granddaughter drives her own carriage, and her granddaughter is trained in performing abortions. She is in the room with Madame Restell. She gives Madame Restell tips on, like, you have to look out for this guy. I think he is a con man. Her daughter is very, very savvy, and her daughter married another doctor and inherited a huge bulk of Madame Restell's wealth and was the executor of her will. And we don't know what happened to Madame Restell's daughter after her marriage to another doctor, but I think it's very likely that on a much quieter scale than Madame Restell, she continued putting what her grandmother taught her into practice and performing abortions.
Yeah, it's also interesting too when you're mentioning her will. We've talked about this, but Madame Restell's life kind of ends in this question mark. Like, there are reports that she commits suicide when police are coming to arrest her again. There are a lot of rumors that she's actually in Europe living her best life.
Her grandchildren go and take a yearly trip to Europe for 3 months every year.
Every single year. What could they be doing?
Her beautiful clothing and jewelry was missing from her house. Her son-in-law said that there was a plan in place to get her to flee the country and go to Europe. So, yeah, there are questions. Yeah.
It's just yeah. It's like, as soon as we find that peach shipment, we'll know.
We'll know.
But I think it also adds a little bit to this idea of her as a transgressor and as a legend and a myth. Like, the ending of her life is so shrouded in mystery that she could still be among, I mean, obviously she's not still among us, but you know what I mean? Like, the legend lives on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think the legend does live on. I wanted to make a t-shirt that said Restell lives on it, but it was a little bit too obscure. But
I will 1,000% wear that with you.
Thank you. We'll be the only two people that get it.
I don't know. I think it could catch on. And also, somebody in the chat, or not somebody in the chat, but somebody in the crowdcast asked about the cover of the book. And I feel like if we get this image on there somehow, like, it could really pop.
Yeah. I love the cover of the book.
It's so fierce.
I love that cover. It's so beautiful. I know there was some back and forth on the cover, and I just think the design team did such an incredible job.
They nailed it.
Really,
they nailed it. Yeah, it's just as I love the hand on her hip, and it's just like as feisty as she is.
It feels very spicy.
It feels spicy. And my favorite little detail, if you have the book, is that there's a little picture of her right there. So even when she's on your bookshelf, just chilling, like, you can still see her with her hands on her hips. Which I just love.
Yes, it's fantastic. It's so good.
A lot. So we did get some questions in advance from some people on Crowdcast. And a lot of the questions were really about your process as a writer and as a historian. So I want to make sure that we can address some of these, because I think they're really relevant to being a historian writing about women's history, particularly. One of these on here that I found really interesting was, thinking about how you deal with writer's block when you're working with the confines of someone's life. And like while you're writing?
I write 500 words every day.
Every
And
single day?
I used to write 1,000 before I was married and I had a kid. But yeah, and that takes a few hours, and some days it's good and some days it's terrible, but either way you get words down on paper. And look, I think my job is pretty easy compared to people who write fiction, because if it is a day where I'm not feeling particularly inspired, then that is a big research day for me, where
Yeah.
find newspapers and basically just transcribe what was going on in these articles and kind of piece them together and figure out what would have been happening this year in Madame Restell's life. So I think there is a huge amount of help for anyone who is writing nonfiction, because the person has already lived their lives. You don't have to figure out how it ends. You just have to do all of the reading and then figure out how the story relates to us in the present day and how to hopefully make the story engaging enough that people want to read it.
Yeah, I think, one of my favorite things about this is I think this book will appeal to a lot of people that think that they don't like nonfiction. I think a lot of people think that they don't like nonfiction or they don't like history because they're imagining like what I lovingly refer to as sepia tone dad history.
Oh my
And
God,
this
yeah.
book is like the exact opposite of
Could
that.
not be sepia toned. It was, I think, my first.
But it's this idea of a book as being kind of boring. And in this book, you infuse a lot of your personality. It's really fucking funny. Like I laughed while I was editing it, and I read the same jokes several times because there were multiple editing rounds.
Look,
But
she's also
it's
really
so modern and fresh.
during the time are really funny. One of the funniest things that has become an anecdote that I tell at parties now was when people at the Sun made up the Great Moon hoax, where they said that bat people were living on the moon. And when they found out that people were taking it totally seriously, just decided to go with it. The British Abolitionist Society issued a statement that if there was slavery happening among the bat people on the moon, they just wanted to say that they were against it. They were against
it's
it.
good to put that out there.
Yeah, they were just putting it out there just in case.
Yeah.
And the next article in the Sun reports that sadly, slavery is a problem about people on the moon.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it's actually, yeah, once they heard the British Abolitionist Society was against it, they wanted
and thank God they were.
problems. Yeah, thank God they were. I think that is so hilarious. I have worked at a few newspapers, and obviously we don't do this anymore because you can't make up insane, fanciful stories. But I can imagine the giddy delight of everyone in a newsroom saying, oh God, we've got to say there's slavery among the bat people. We've got to make it a thing now.
You gotta wonder like what these people were on.
I mean, so much of it just has to do with incredible credulity of the populace.
Yeah.
Just if you read something anywhere, you really have no way to reference whether or not that is true. Like your sources are very, very limited. And all of the newspapers say different things. It was pretty common during this period that you'd have to read 3 different newspapers. And one would say there was, a massive riot on the Lower East Side, and it was all started by Irishmen. And the other newspaper would say, actually, it was all started by Germans. And you kind of figure, well, like, I guess some immigrants were involved, and maybe it was, a middle number of what they're saying. So the New York Times really changed all of that when they said, we are going to tell an absolutely accurate story, and you only have to buy one newspaper now.
Revolutionary, really.
Yeah, record of history, changed everything.
It's fast. It's so wild, and it ties into another one of these questions, which is talking about what your research process looks like. And obviously you're reading through these, and you could read a historical record about bat people alongside, reading.
Sorry, pausing for 1 second because my computer's about to shut down. I need to plug it in. Hold on.
That's That's totally good. Just as a reminder, if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. I have some here to refer to, but this book was so fun to work on, and honestly, I could talk about this with Jen for hours. So, totally get if you want to read it and then get questions later.
Okay, there we go. My computer is now plugged in.
Saved.
Yes, my research process. We are
Yeah.
so live in an age where we have access to just a stupendous number of newspapers from the past, and you can access them all on your computer. The Library of Congress digitized almost all the newspapers that have been published from 1776 onwards, and that is astonishing to me that it exists and can make my job so easy. I'm also so indebted to people at the New York Public Library. People in the research department were incredible about pulling articles that they thought would be relevant to this book and to the period in general. And they're incredible. They're so great. Librarians are the best people in the world.
Hell yeah. How long did it take you to, from the moment when you were like, I think this could be a book, till, doing the proposal, to doing all of the research, to writing it? Like, how long did that whole process take you?
About 3 years, because I needed to, and like I was not working on it full time. I think from the time I started the first sentence of the book to writing the end, it took about a year. But I wanted
You
to
also had a baby during that time. I feel like
I had a baby halfway through that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to work out a timeline, and I wanted to know more about this person in general. And I pretty much inevitably, if you are studying any historical figure, you are going to find out that they did something terrible.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that the terrible things that Madame Restel did were things that I could live with, that wouldn't make me want to abandon this figure to the dustbin of history forever.
Yeah.
So I was spending a few years just kind of idly reading what was available about her. And also, you kind of want to see if you feel like you can add anything to the subject. And there are 2 other biographies on Madame Restel right now. One's by Alan Keller, one's by Clifford Browder. And the Browder one is very good. The Browder one is kind of a just the facts, only Madame Restel's life approach to Madame Restel. But I wanted to be able to use her life to talk a little bit more about abortion and talk about women's rights and talk about what the position of women in society would have been in this age. So hopefully this book maybe accomplished that.
I mean, I certainly think it. It's really, you're looking at Madame Restel's life, but you're also really looking at her as a lens to seeing this whole era of shifting women's rights and shifting attitudes
that can get you through birth control and women's rights in the 19th century.
Yeah. And she's just like endlessly fascinating. Like the little anecdotes that you would send me. I mean, there were plenty that didn't even make it into the book, because if we just wrote a book on every funny, weird thing Restel did, like that could be its own separate book. But she was just like such a funny, fascinating person.
She was so bold in ways that I don't think I will ever be bold as a person. I feel like when somebody is fighting with me on Twitter, that is a very bad day for me. Like I'm very stressed about it. I'm distracted by it. And I think Madame Restel relished it in a way that would have been especially unladylike at the time, where every time anyone criticized her, like she is writing an article and it is running in the newspaper the next day.
She would have loved talking to her trolls. Like if she had a Twitter account, I think she would have loved having a Twitter account.
I think she would have too. I think she would have been a problematic fave on Twitter.
Oh, hell yeah. We would have had a harder time publishing this, probably, looking through her tweet history, because I feel like there could have been a lot of problematic stuff in there.
There would have been. I'm oddly not racist. That was amazing to me, because every time I read anything,
and I'm really grateful for that.
I know, it's a miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, usually I will read something from like a wonderful, wonderful suffragette, and I'm reading along and I'm being, oh, what an inspiration, what a nice lady. And then she'll say something like, what's important is that we don't become like the Chinese, the worst people in the world. And I'll be like, oh, there it is. There it is.
Yeah, we don't know, back a little bit to Estelle, but we don't know if she treated non-white patients, or we do know a little. We have an idea.
Was we at least know that people of color were aware of her services, and they knew where to find her. I mean, we have very few records from patients that she actually treated. Obviously, a lot of women wanted to keep this very quiet,
Yeah.
but we do know that she worked on a sliding scale, and she treated a lot of people who were in service. And I think some of those people were probably women of color.
Yeah. And especially if you look at the demographics of New York at that time, like,
You look at the demographics of New York at that time, I think
yeah.
it would have been very, very possible.
Yeah. So I guess, like, thinking back on this whole process, what about this whole experience was the most challenging, and what was the most rewarding for you as a writer, but also as a woman becoming a mom at the same time?
Um, I, you know, I think we sold this book around the same day that I got pregnant, and I
I
did.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it was like right after I got pregnant,
Oh,
and
wow.
and I did have some concerns doing it. Of like, I am so excited about this baby. I had wanted this baby for so many years, and my husband and I were so ecstatic, and I wondered, okay, as I write this, I wonder if this is going to change my pro-choice views. And it did change them. It made them much stronger. I think until you have given birth, you are not fully aware of all the things that can go wrong while giving birth, and what an incredibly scary and powerless thing that can feel like. And I've now talked to many other women who have become mothers who had much more difficult medical experiences during pregnancy and childbirth than I have. I had a really difficult birth, but otherwise, I never had postpartum depression. I didn't have preeclampsia. I didn't have untreated preeclampsia. I didn't have postpartum psychosis. In many ways, I came out of my birth just fine. I have friends who have had a much harder time, and it really drives home for me the fact that people who think, well, you can just put the baby up for adoption, are not thinking about the woman's body or life at
Yeah.
all. They are seeing this person as an incubator for a fetus. Yeah, birth is incredibly hard. It's one of the most difficult things a person can do.
Yeah, I do remember that I had a note or something uh right around the time that you were either you had just given birth or you were in the hospital, and I remember you emailed me right back, and I was like, Jen, you're allowed to just have your baby. You don't have to email me back right now. I was so on it.
And I will say that something that embarrasses me so much now. I was a week late giving birth, so I had to be induced. And usually, what that means is just you're hooked up to an epidural, and and I was honestly kind of excited about it because I thought, like, okay, great, I can call my parents and my in-laws the night before. They're going to be on a plane. We can time this all perfectly. We know when I'm giving birth now. And I remember before we went to the hospital, I told my husband we should bring the Scrabble board because this is going to take like a day, and I'll up to an epidural, and like we might get bored, and I really like to play Scrabble. So we brought the Scrabble board, and then my epidural did not work. And the reason you get an epidural if you're induced is because the contractions are extra strong. So my birth experience was unbelievably painful. Just truly the worst thing I could imagine going through as a human. And then I hemorrhaged, and And I lost half the blood in my body. It was bad. It was fine. I had great doctors. They, took out my ratty placenta and gave me a lot of blood transfusions. But afterwards, I really wanted to get back to things being normal so quickly. Like I wanted everything to be fine as fast as possible. I kept asking the doctors and the nurses like if they could unplug me from all of the machines because I really did not enjoy that. And yeah, I wanted to jump right back in to writing the book because it felt more important now than it ever had to me before. And especially important because then I had a daughter and I wanted to make sure that she has full autonomy over her body and that she gets to choose how she uses it. And if she wants to choose to become a mother, I will be so happy about that. But I think she also has the right to choose not to be a mother.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I take away from the abortion debate and from this book is that motherhood should be a choice. And just because you're pro-abortion doesn't mean that you, don't want there to be any babies at all. It means that you just want women to be able to have choices about what happens to their body.
I think something that my own pregnancy experience really drove home for me was I I did IVF for years. I have always wanted to be a mother. My husband and I always wanted to have children. So happy to have our daughter. But I realized as I was going through the pregnancy process, and because I'd done a lot of IVF, I was going in for a lot of doctor's appointments to see how things were going in there. And every time I went in for those doctor's appointments, you kind of had to take a minute beforehand and realize that something could have gone wrong. That this might be the time that they say, okay, the fetus is developing without a skull, or the fetus is developing without kidneys. And at that point, you have to make a horrible choice. And I think women who choose to try to go through with it and carry to term are making a really brave choice. And I think women who choose to try to spare a baby, that very brief life of incredible pain, are making a very brave choice. But you cannot think of yourself as somebody who would never have an abortion because if you are in that position, you don't know what you do. And I've had friends now who have been in that position, and it is awful. And I am glad that they have the option of aborting right there.
One thing, and you briefly referred to this earlier, but towards the end of RESTELL's career, a man named Anthony Comstock comes in and he
fucks everything up real bad, Carrie.
He fucks everything up real bad. And now in Texas, we're seeing Comstock laws named after him coming back to the front of the stage again, reinforcing this idea that everything is really circular. What do you think RESTELL would say about Comstock laws coming back now?
She couldn't believe it the first time. She thought that Comstock must be motivated by money, and she couldn't figure out that people weren't paying him to do this. So I think she would be even more bewildered that they're trying to bring that back now. But a lot of the reason that the Comstock laws were so successful, and the Comstock laws forbade sharing any information about abortion. And certainly mailing any birth control through the mail, which I think is probably why they're focusing on it in Texas right now. And there are also a lot of states are trying to ban access to websites that provide information about abortion. So we are seeing a repeat of the Comstock laws there.
Yeah.
The motivation and a lot of the reason those were so successful was because white people at the time were very afraid that they were going to be replaced by Irish immigrants and by the newly freed Black populace after the Civil War. And I think as we see those fears again being stoked on Fox News, we're really just enduring a repeat of same fears and the same ideas that if you stop white women from having abortions, then you can raise the white birth rate to compete with that. So it's all grounded in very unfortunate thinking.
And white supremacy.
White supremacy, very racist, white supremacist thinking. Yes.
Yeah. We are almost out of time, but for the last question, I wanted to ask you, what do you want readers to come away from this book with? Like, in your ideal world, when the reader closes the final pages of this book, you know, what do you want them to leave with?
Well, I really want them to leave with the idea that banning abortion does not stop abortion. That we see Michigan Board of Health, 1898, 25 years after the passage of the Comstock laws, says that 1/3 of pregnancies in the state are terminated by abortion. In Madame Restell's time, it was only about 1 out of 5. So, if anything, at least in some states, there ended up being more abortions. They were just done more incompetently than Madame
Yeah.
would have been doing them. And I think that's really important to remember. I think it's also really important to remember that you do need to speak out about these things as they're happening. Something that scares me right now is that so much is happening and women have been so calm about it that people I think I think if there had been any medical procedure mandated on men, if you passed a bill saying that people have to get a COVID shot, people would have burnt down the White House.
Yeah.
And I think we really respect the idea of bodily autonomy in America as long as it extends to men. When it extends to women, we're not as interested in that because I think there is still a mentality that sees a woman's purpose as being to produce babies. And I think that is something that everybody invested in this needs to speak out against as much as they possibly can in whatever way they can.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. If you haven't already, please read this book, talk about it with your friends. Honestly, it's perfect for book clubs because it's really fucking funny, but you'll also leave it feeling a lot smarter, which is like a win-win. I also wish this conversation could be an hour longer. Now I just want to call Jen and talk with her about Mississippi.
Well, lovely. I'll talk about 19th century.
I would
anyone forever.
for days. But thank you so much to everybody for joining us. I really appreciate your time, and I would love to hear what you think after you read this book.